Hey everyone, it's me, Tombox, and I am back on Master Duel. This video is going to be the shortcut ticket to help you guys get to Diamond 1. So there are two things that all Diamond 1 players have in common. One, they have matchup knowledge, and two, they understand the skill ceiling of their own deck. In other words, they do their homework. Today, I'm going to be your friend that you're going to copy the homework off of. I'm going to be the cheat sheet, the shortcut to beating the most played decks, the barrier decks that prevent you from advancing into Diamond 1. And don't worry, I'm going to keep it simple for you guys, so welcome to How to Beat Master Duel Season 14. So for today, we're going to cover the 4 biggest barriers: Mech, Runic, Sword Soul, and Despia. Number 1, Mech. They are the best deck right now, and for good reason. Number 1, they have an outrageous number of special summon to the point that you feel like you never have enough to actually beat them. Like, you can't disrupt them enough, they just keep coming. Number 2, they have a very safe going first combo line. Yeah, they're just that good, and they pay some stuff for cost, just get free monsters. Number 3, they have very strong end boards. It doesn't look like much at first, but once you get into playing your turn, you'll realize they have an Omni Negate, they're sending your stuff away. They've got a ton of things, and it's layered between the front row and the back row. And it's not like they put all their eggs in one basket, because they're playing Cyberse, they have access code, they just have everything. And all of this stuff stems from a 1-card combo. Well, so how do you beat them? It really depends, but I'll try to break it down between going first and going second. In the case that you're going second, after the whole Maxi Ash call by, will they, won't they, love triangle, we get into the actual board, which is Super Factorio, IP Masquerena, maybe a Lingaribo, and perhaps, worst case scenario, there is a Code Talker also on the field because they use Microcoder, whatnot, to get into that particular board. That means the back row also has a Signet Conflict. For that particular board, I don't really have too much to suggest because the interaction's still super layered, and that's basically a board that's going to require at least 4 cards to break, or you have to change the tempo. That's the only recommendation if they have the counter trap. But if they don't have the counter trap, we can crack it one by one. First of all, Super Factorio. I recommend having some level of grave interruption here. Preventing the Super Factorio from resolving is very key, or at least preventing the Laplacian from coming out with 3 materials. And the material that you have to stop from coming out is the Diameter. Diameter, whenever used as a material, it provides that monster that exceeds summon into it using it as a material to get 1 Omni Negate for the turn. That is the thing that really stops everything. But on top of that, if you manage to use 3 material for the Laplacian, well, I guess you're going to have to deal with your front row being sent to the graveyard, your back row being sent to the graveyard, and a card randomly in your hand also being sent to the graveyard. So that has to be stopped. If you don't stop that, it could potentially lead to a neg-3, and no one really comes back from a neg-3. And if you call by the Diameter, they're not going to be able to use it on their turn since they're still stunned out, and it increases your chances of survival. So what about the Lingaribo and the IP Masquerena? Well, for those two, you're going to have to bait them into activating the IP by special summoning something that's non-committal, or normal summoning that's non-committal, so they can follow up with more special summons and go into the battle phase. That battle phase call is going to force them to react, either use the IP Masquerena or lose it. And you have to layer it like this. Or they can just use Super Factorio. But if they use Super Factorio before the IP Masquerena even turned into anything, that is your opportunity to use stuff like DD Crow or your Ghost Spell, because they haven't established their negation yet. By threatening your opponent's IP Masquerena with the battle phase, it really takes the control away from them, and it offers you more time to react within the main phase without committing more resources, and that's, slowly cracking away at their board. Now, alternatively, you can prevent them from building their board. It is a little bit riskier, but the first thing you would disrupt would be at the LM version, because that's the card that's going to be searching for the first Diameter. It's a bit of a gamble, because if they hard opened it, then they already countered you, so that part is a bit unfortunate. The other card that, if you have more disruption that you want to stop, would be the Cyberse Wicked, because again, it leads to more searching, and I don't want them to search a Microcoder to go into a counter trap, because that is actually really hard to play against. Now, the other way is to just eat the Super Factorio, but you eat it paired with a Forbidden Droplet so that you can turn it off completely and the entire board can be turned off. If you're a grave-centric deck, then that would be my recommendation for you. But if you really want to shut people down, then you can consider using Drone Lockbird. There's a lot of searching that happens with this deck, especially when it comes to the first copy of the Super Factorio, and then the Diameter, and then there's also the second Diameter. If you stop all those search lines, there's almost like nothing left for that deck. So let's shift gears for a second. What if they're going second into your board that you've built? You've got some level of disruption, but you don't want to waste it. So number one thing you need to know is you got to stop Diameter if you can, If you can't, then you have to bait the negate that it has, just so that you can stop the update jammer from coming out. And ideally, if they're going for the access code kill play with the update jammer and popping, just basically just wipe your board and just hit you for 10,000. That particular play, if you have your Call by the Grave, your DD Crow, your Ghost Spell, save it for the update jammer revival from transcode, and you're gonna be much better off. But in the case that you can't do that, try to put a monster on the field that is basically indestructible. They cannot be destroyed by card effect. They're gonna have a much rougher time because they have to swing into that, and they're not gonna have that 10,000 damage on you. So there's that. Alternatively, you can also prevent them from getting their boards established. Like the Prime Mathmech Island version, you can probably negate that, preventing them from getting that search. But in the worst case scenario, you have nothing left, try to hold one gate just for the access code talker and bait out the whatever that is holding the negate coming from the diameter. That will be your best bet. And once you get your turn back, that's a hard commitment for them because they tried to go for the kill shot rather than build board, and you're going to be able to get your turn back and maybe just counter OTK them back. Deck number 2, Sword Soul Tenyi. This deck is super popular. Of course, it has very short combos, a fantastic extra deck that is essentially a toolbox to handle 90% of scenarios. The Tenyi monsters themselves act as extenders as well as non-committal free summons and act as removal as well. Just with one monster revealing another, if you got the Moye, then you get to establish 3 disruptions on the game state, both in the front and back row, which is really good. And worst case scenario, you get an attribute stunned by Arch Nemesis Protos. And they have a Synchro 10, a Synchro 8, and mostly Chi-Sha, and maybe another Synchro 8 that's either going to be a Berserker or it's probably a Adamancipate or Dragite. And in the case that they don't do that, they're probably putting up Protos, or they've got a bunch of back row because they could not commit into the additional monster, which is also normal. So expect the Synchro 10. The 10 could be either the Baron, so it's an Omni Negate, or it's a removal based one, and that's going to be the Sinister Longyan. And sometimes you might see a Chen Ying in there, but Chen Ying right now is not exactly the strongest play because there's so many negation flying around that Chen Ying is not really proccing its effect. Lucky for us, we can trade 1-for-1 for a lot of these interactions because they're more reactive than anything. So if you use stuff like Droplet, you can pretty much clear the entire board. Simply by summoning out a monster and try to bait Chi-Sha to use the Chi-Sha, great, and then you chain Droplet, sending it away, hitting the Baron instead. Now you've basically burned away the Chi-Sha negate, and you've also turned off the Baron, but be careful. When you commit into the board like this, when there's 2 cards on the field, you might get hit by a blackout, so you should be expecting that there's a blackout play in there, just in case. Now, in terms of trying to stop your opponent from building the board, if you have Ash and Incredible Ecclesia, especially when they normal summoned it, that is a very painful play. 90% of the time, they're going to skip their turn right away and pass it back to you. One thing that you can't really stop, that is the Protos. If they summon out Protos, you just have to pray that he doesn't hit your attribute. Because if he shuts down your special summon ability for the entire turn, you could be screwed, or you're playing for Wunderies. What if the roles were now reversed? What if they're playing into your board? What do you need to know to stop them? Well, aside from the main stuff in the extra deck you already know, you need to know the rest of that extra deck. It's so important because a lot of their toolbox is there. So first of all, Dragite, Adamancipated Dragite, their spell trap removal, they have a water monster. Moye is water, so they get spell trap negation from that. Then there's Baxia, that's their double spin back into the deck. You don't want to let this land any effects. You want to Veiler this, you want to Imperm this, you want to make sure that this thing has nothing to resolve, otherwise you're going to die. Because if it spins away 2 cards, that's 2 big threats removed, and then it will attempt to pop something to revive a Sword Soul monster, and once it gets to that Sword Soul monster, then there's the Tenyi line. If they're running low on resources, then the Tenyi line is one of their greatest options, because for a low price of maybe 1 or 2 Tenyis, you get to build all the way back to a full board, break something, and maybe even end on a Draco Berserker. Again, I can't emphasize enough, never let Baxia resolve. Always negate the Longyan in the hand that's trying to summon out, and if they're attempting to go into Tenyi plays, your goal is to remove all non-effect monsters off of the field. Clear as much as you can. You need to get rid of, say, the Monk, so that they can't activate their Adhara or their Ashuna, preventing them from recycling their resources or even using the Heavenly Dragon Circle in the graveyard. Deck number 3, everyone's favorite deck, Runic. If you're playing this deck, you're basically invited to everyone's birthday party. I'm just kidding. Everyone finds this deck probably to be very annoying, but this is a very strong deck. It is a stun and mill deck, and most of the milling happens from your deck, and they get banished face up every single time they successfully resolve something. The toolkit of this deck is pretty strong. I mean, you have special summon destruction, you have effect negation, you have protection, you have spell trap removal, you have everything that makes a good Yu-Gi-Oh deck good. The only part is you don't have really a battle phase anytime you activate one of these cards, so there's no real attacking. If you try to attack, I find it pretty cute. And then they have a really solid draw engine, drawing 3 cards at a time, maybe 6 cards at a time, because they have Runic Fountain. Anytime you activate one of the Runic quick plays, you get to, well, put your own stuff back and draw that many cards. And as for the rest of it, to secure the game, they play Amano Iwado as their floodgate monster, preventing any sort of negation when it comes to activating their spells when it comes to monster. And then they play Gozen Rivalry, there can be only one, and Skill Drain, so that, you know, you can play at the same level as them. You know, no monster effects. So how do you beat this deck? Well, the obvious answer is a spell trap negation. And why do you even need trap negation? That's because they played way too many floodgates for you to even establish a chance at cracking at their life points, so you probably could play something like Red Reboot. I don't know if I would recommend Red Reboot because the coverage on the other matchup isn't actually that strong, but it's good enough to stop Super Factorio, it's good enough to stop Blackout, it's good enough in this case where you can stop a floodgate and then you get a whole turn to crack at your opponent's life points, so that's good enough in my opinion, so you can consider using Red Reboot in the format. But now, if they actually develop their entire board and you have to deal with the spells, then ideally you need to remove the field spell as soon as possible. Ideally something non-destructive. You can't really use, say, cards like Lightning Storm or Harvey's Feather Duster because they're just going to summon out Hugin, and Hugin is going to just substitute destruction, and you can't really stop that. So yeah, those are some of the angles you can hit. Now, if you have Ash Blossom, hit Pot of Desires, hit Card of Demise, also hit the Runic Fountain whenever it's trying to draw 3 cards. That's really important. If they activate the Max C, you go into that. You make them draw a ton of cards. Make sure they load up because they can only activate so many cards until basically their hand's full. And then you try to end on as small of a board as possible, and then you do absolutely nothing. You tribute set, leave your monster face down so they can't really do anything to it, and they can't even like mill you out like crazy. That's the whole point. You want to minimize your board down to basically almost nothing, and then you can watch them deck themselves out. As for going first, there's really not that much to cover aside from, you know, when they get to the end phase, try to get rid of the field spell so that your turn is going to be a lot easier to play. You can even try to play stuff like Anti-Spell Fragrance and Spell Cancel. Anti-Spell Fragrance buys you 2 turns. It's so slow for them, and they need to take some extra time to crack it unless they already open with the Spell Trap Destruction. Otherwise, they're in for a really rough time. Use Cosmic Cyclone to clear off the field spell, and you're pretty much good. And finally, of course, Branded Despia. The deck is still super strong, even though several cards on the deck already got hit, but regardless, Branded Fusion, 1 card set up everything. It has an insane amount of graveyard interaction and follow-up, and it can close a game up with burn damage by setting up Masquerade, and now if you play a card, you die. So yeah, that's pretty rough. Not to mention that Mirror Jade and Guardian Chimera are really insane board removal. Going second against Branded Despia, how do you beat them? Like, they're establishing a board. Well, the first thing is you should prevent the establishment. This is one of the decks where prevention is probably better than breaking. You should stop the Branded Fusions from going off by using Ash. And if you're able to stop it, then that's perfect, because even if they have Branded Lost on the field, this is the 1 card that can just essentially just bypass it. I would go as far as to using Maxi as a bait on the Call by the Grave, and that particular interaction is probably when they activate, like, opening, you chain Maxi, they Call by the Grave, great, now I'll have Ash and Ash the Branded Fusion, and that is the interaction we're going for. Yes, you have both Ash and Maxi in your hand to kind of stop this particular play, but it is worth it. I'm telling you, it is totally worth it. Yeah, that's one way you can do it, but they might follow it with some Edgem Chain stuff so that they can play Poly to get the fusion, but then they're committing more cards. It's very different when they use Branded Fusion, because once you get to the Mirror Jade might just banish the Despia monster on the field, and then they set up the Albion Engrave, and that's going to be branded in red. In the case that they do get all the way to the setup, the branded in red is the other thing that you need to stop, but it's pretty easy. Just anti-graveyard removal or anti-graveyard movement, and that's good enough. If they use the Mirror Jade on their turn, by stopping the branded in red, you essentially probably stop the ad libitum from refreshing that Mirror Jade so that it gets another activation, and you also prevented the Guardian Chimera from coming out, and that's a lot of resources that they're not going to have, and they can't use Mirror Jade to throw another Albion into the graveyard or something that would actually trigger in the graveyard. So if they built the board and there's like 1 or 2 monsters, or maybe just 1 monster, what you can do to stop Guardian Chimera is to actually just clear the monster. Get rid of it, because Guardian Chimera needs to fuse with either 1 or 2 monsters on the field or 1 or 2 in the hand. And simply because of that, removing the monster could lead them into only summoning out Masquerade instead. And that is much easier and much easier to handle compared to the Guardian Chimera clearing multiple cards and drawing cards. Basically, it just keeps fueling them and going and going. And the last thing I have to remind you of is check the graveyard. There's so many things that can activate the graveyard. The Aluber can randomly just jump out if you accidentally clear off a fusion monster. That's a big problem. If there is the Chaotis, remember that if you remove Chaotis with a card effect, then it's going to summon out either Fallen of Albaz or another Despian monster straight from the deck. And if it's a Fallen of Albaz, they may perform, I don't know, a super poly-esque play and just get rid of one of your cards. So just be very careful. As for the other cards, Albion, you have to check. You have to check for Tragedies in the graveyard, because if Tragedies in the graveyard, essentially they have one of their cards in the graveyard in their hand, or rather on the field, and they can just use it. It's a lot to keep track of. And also branded opening. If you think you're going to be destroying something and all of a sudden they don't die and that becomes your problem, you might have burned away a battle phase accidentally. These are everything you have to constantly check into the graveyard. Like phase after phase or turn after turn, check their graveyard. Now what if you're going first? As for going first, if you want to stop them, it's essentially the same stuff. Stop the Branded Fusion, because Branded Fusion just gives them way too much stuff. Be careful of the Fallen of Albaz. If they use Fallen of Albaz's effect, you can clear it by negating it or just by destroying it, because it needs to use itself as a fusion material. Remove the Albions from the graveyard, and if there is, say, a Mirror Jade, if they somehow get to Mirror Jade on the field, but you negated Mirror Jade, you're gonna have to somehow remove the Mirror Jade, and ideally you use a bounce effect. You don't want it to trigger, because if it gets banished or if it leaves the field by basically anything that you do, it's going to Raigeki your side of the field. And to prevent that, you're going to need to spin it back into the deck or hand, and in those spaces they do not trigger. So that's probably one of the ways that you can clear it. And again, check the graveyard. That's really it. I mean, they're not that difficult. They're probably one of the easier ones to read. Well, that's all I got for this one. If you guys are like stuck in gold, stuck in platinum, can't get to diamond 1, use this as a reminder, a little cheat sheet of how to conserve the resources. A lot of this stuff helped me out to climb to diamond 1. I'm sure it can help you guys climb to diamond 1. So best of luck on your climb. And remember guys, there is a Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel 1st Anniversary Invitational. You guys can check it out on March 10th on Twitch and YouTube. And then until next time, I'll see you guys at Diamond 1.